In this video, we're going to learn about React Context and the problem that it aims to solve. I've created a little application for a website called Coffee House. This application needs to display the username in several parts of the application, up here in the header, here in the main area where you can update the name, and in the footer. To get a better idea of this application, let's take a look at a diagram. This is how our application is going to work. In the app component, we're going to have a username. That username is going to be passed down to our various components through props. App is going to contain a header, a content, and a footer component. Then the header is going to contain two components as well, branding and a menu. And then this can be shown in our application. So this is our header over here. This is the branding that just says Coffee House. And this is the menu over here, represented by these two different components. The content is also has two different components. It has a promo ad and an update profile. The promo ad is this picture over here that gets displayed. And then we have our update profile over here. Lastly, we got our footer. Our footer is also split between the left and the right. So we have our footer branding and our footer links. So kind of like the header. Here's our branding and here's the link. The way information will be passed around for the username is that the app will have the username and then pass it down through props to the various layers. So through the header, it would pass a prop down for username here and here to get to the menu. To display it on the user profile, once again, goes through the content and then down to the update profile. And same thing for the footer. So we're passing a lot of props around to make this application work. Let's take a look at the code. Now, if we take a look at the code, starting from our app, we're tracking some state, the username. Then we have to pass that username into our header, our content, and our footer. Additionally, the content also gets an update method. Then inside the header, if we take a look at that one, we have to destructure the username, then go into the menu, pass the menu in. Then once we get to the menu, destructure the value, then finally consume and use that value. Our content is exactly the same as well, except we're passing two values in, then update profile gets two values, destructures those two values, and then eventually uses those two values in the code so that we can go ahead and we can change the name and we see it reflected here and we see it reflected over here at the bottom in the footer. And the footer is exactly the same too. Pass in that thing, go into another component, pass it in, destructure it, then finally use it. As you can see, it gets really complicated when you have to continue to pass props from layer to layer. To make this code easier to read and easier to use, we're going to use a new feature in React called React Context. So if we go back to our diagram, you'll see that everywhere that I marked blue over here is everywhere that we had to pass that prop down. Now let's go to a different diagram where we use context. In this diagram over here, you can see the blue areas are where we're specifically using the username. Now app is highlighted because it's going to be setting everything up for us. Then, lower in our diagram over here, you'll see that everything else is yellow, except for the components that are blue that actually use the username and show it on the screen. Now, what this little area over here does, user context, what it's saying is that any components that are within this little block over here are allowed to access the username through the context. Context can also be thought of as global data. Up here in the app, we set that global data, and then later down inside our application, we access that global data without having to pass it through props. Let's take a look at a simple example of using a context in React. So back in the application over here, and this is the application that I'll be uploading to GitHub. If we go to a different branch and we go to the branch called hooks initial, we'll go to that branch and this will be the initial introduction to how we use context. Within our app.js, if you recall in our diagram over here, this is where we're originally going to set the username. So if we go inside our app.js, we're going to see that we have React.create context. We don't have to import anything extra, just import React. Then that creates a variable for us, a variable that we want to export. We set it as a constant and we also export it so that other parts of our application, like the header, can import it to get the value. Now all you have to do with the username context that we defined over here is wrap the components. Now in our diagram, we said all of these components over here will be able to access the username regardless of which component they are or where they are in the component tree. Going back to our app.js over here, what we do with that user context is we have to wrap our code and we have to wrap it with the provider. So you say user context dot provider, wrap the header, content, and footer and all the components below it. If we go ahead and change that initial value of our user context over here to Jim, and then refresh our application, you'll see that the only part that changes right now is the header. It's the only part of the application that's using context. So let's take a look at how that works. You'll notice the header has no props passed in. We go into the header, also no props destructured or passed to the menu. And then within the menu, what we're doing is we're using a hook called useContext. The useContext hook is used to get the value from our context. So the value that we're going to get is the username from the username context. You can see that over here, we import the user context from React. Then we also import the username context that we created back in our app.js over here. Then back inside our menu over here, we go use context, pass in the username context, and it gives us back a username. We then take that username and display it on the page, just like you would with state or props. Let's go try using this pattern on another part of our application. So we'll go to our footer, and then within our footer, we'll go to the footer links. Now we just have to do a couple of things. One is we need to import useContext. We'll import useContext from React. Then we also need to import the username context that we created back inside of our app. So we'll go back to our footer links and we'll import that. And that's not a default, so we need to put braces around it. And we'll just import that from our app file. Then inside our footer link, we'll just define a constant at the top and use that hook to get the username. And inside useContext, all we do is pass in the username context. We get that value back, and then we can replace the atom over here with username. And now when we do that, remember our default value is Jim. If we go look at our footer over here, we'll see that the value now is Jim. The only thing that we haven't done is the update. Now we could change our user name context to just be user context and provide the value with an object that represents not only the current name, but also a way to set it. Instead, I'm going to show you a much more elegant solution. So this solution is over here in another branch called Hooks Improved. Now you'll notice this solution over here is using a component that I've created called user provider inside our app.js. That user provider looks just like our other provider, and it takes in a value, so our application over here displays as it always did. Now, if we go inside of this user provider, this is where the real magic happens. We actually have two contexts inside here. We have a username context, which is the same one that we had before, and we also have an update username context. So think of this as your set method. Now let's take a closer look. If we jump into our app.js over here, we have a user provider. The user provider takes a value, and also you'll notice the user provider wraps these other elements. When it wraps other elements, that means it can take it in as children. So here's our user provider, and then we destructure the value out and the children, which represent all the other components. Then if we look at our return statement over here, what we're doing is we're using the children over here in between the contexts. And above, we take that value in and we actually have some internal state. That internal state is the username and a set username. So that username over here is being used by our username context of provider and is represented by that value. And then our set username is used by the update username context of provider. Now, all of this is tucked away and hidden away inside the user provider. To expose a way for our application to go ahead and make use of these values, the name value and the set name, we export two custom hooks, a username, and it's wrapped by useContext username context. So we're able to extract the value that's here using useContext and giving it that context. And then use update username, well, we extracted that method using useContext and the update username context. And now here's the really elegant part of our application. Once again, no properties are being passed in, but if we jump into that menu, the way we use this is we import our username from our user context. And then all we have to do is say const username equals username, then display that value. And it's really, really elegant and looks really nice. If we go back to our application and we go into our content, jump down into our update profile name, it's also just as elegant. Use username gets us the name over here. And then we also extract the method that we can use to update. So in this particular part of the application over here, all we're doing is we're storing some internal state so that as I type, it doesn't change the value. But when I click the update button, what happens is the onClick event fires. We throw our onUpdate username over here, and all we do is call this here, which then will update the value inside of our context. And this here provides a much more elegant solution. If you enjoy my videos, please subscribe, like, and share.